Hello, everyone. So, wanted to do a video about the book of Acts because that was one of the questions that I had received. So, the book of Acts, we read it during Easter season as a sort of a response. So, Jesus Christ is risen. Now we are responsible for taking that message out to the world. And the book of Acts wants to answer that. And so we read the book of Acts in place of the Old Testament during the season as a reminder that that's part of our call as Christians, is to take the risen Lord out to the world. One way that I like to frame it in terms of the Bible. So you've got the Gospels in the first part of the New Testament, and then the book of Acts, and then the epistles, the letters. And so you've got the Gospels, which are focused on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. People are literally walking with Jesus here. And then you have the epistles, where there are church communities facing different issues. They're looking for, teaching, or they have problems and issues that someone has to address, which is the bulk of Paul's letters, having to address issues and problems in churches, in congregations, and communities. And so the book of Acts is sort of bridging that by, the proclamation of the King of Jesus, the proclamation of Jesus as Lord, creates these communities. The communities are where Jesus is preached. And now when I say preached and proclaiming in this sense, I don't mean proclaiming and preaching about Jesus, but that we are proclaiming Jesus to the world in word and deed. And it's a sort of a lived experience, a lived encounter with Jesus in our own lives that we then share with others. So, this is how Jesus continues to be present. This is part of that power of the Holy Spirit, that we are connected to Jesus. And when we proclaim him, we're not just teaching others about him, like any old historical figure, but we are proclaiming his power. We're proclaiming his love. We are kind of also embodying his power and his love. Okay? So, think of it this way. When people have taught you about Jesus and you have taken it to heart, and then you go and take that message to other people, you're kind of connecting people together with this proclamation. I'm connected to all those Christian thinkers, that have formed me as a Christian, whether or not they're ancient Christians, more modern Christians, Christians still living. All those people have formed me. And so then when I talk about Jesus, you don't know it, but when I'm talking about Jesus, you're also kind of, 2 or 3 or 4 degrees removed from a bunch of other Christians who have formed me. And of course, ultimately, all proclamation about Jesus and a proclamation of Jesus goes back to Jesus, who is a living, breathing, resurrected person. So, a little mysticism for you there. And so the book of Acts is sort of showing that transition point. At the beginning of the book of Acts, we have the ascension of Jesus. Jesus ascends into heaven. He does not appear to his disciples in the same way that he has after the resurrection. And then still somehow the community of the disciples, who generally didn't get it when Jesus was alive, they receive this gift of the Holy Spirit, and they go out to teach and to preach and to share this message with all the world. And they find a receptive audience. They find people throughout the Mediterranean world who want this relationship with Jesus, who accept this relationship with Jesus, and come into the community. And the community spreads. The community opens up to many other people. So partly the story of Acts is, it's the development of the church, but it's also the power of the Spirit, the power of the Holy Spirit working in the world and working in the church. So pay attention to that thing. Keep that in mind. The fact that people can do all these various things. I mean, you have Peter, who goes from this bumbling, lovable disciple to, who also denies Jesus during his, the crucifixion, becomes this powerful preacher, teacher, and leader in the early church. You have St. Stephen, who goes from being this wise young man who is enlisted to help distribute alms to poor widows suddenly becomes this preacher when he's targeted out for death, and he is stoned to death, and he has this vision of Jesus, and he is granted this grace, and he is the first martyr of the church. And then you have Saul, who becomes St. Paul. Saul, who is there at the stoning of Stephen, so Stephen is murdered in front of Saul, and Saul is still persecuting the church, and then suddenly he has his vision and goes and becomes this great preacher and teacher and evangelist and pastor. So clearly the Holy Spirit is capable of taking bumbling people and making them great teachers, of preparing people for the darkest moments of their lives when they experience death and persecution and hate, and takes even people who persecute the church and can turn them to a force of good and love in the world. That's power of the Holy Spirit. So if you don't think the Holy Spirit can work with you, read the book of Acts. The Holy Spirit can work with so much and so little and make it over and abundant. The parable of the mustard seed comes true with the power of the Holy Spirit. Acts also has to deal with the question of who can be part of the church. Who is this message intended for? The fact that Christianity goes from being, in this narrow province of the Roman Empire that had been conquered, the province of Israel, to spreading throughout the Mediterranean. The author of the book of Acts is, they're saying that that's also a sign of the Holy Spirit, that clearly God is at work in spreading this message. It's not just the people doing it, that God is working in this. This continues on a theme of the Gospel of Luke. The book of Acts is kind of a sequel to the Gospel of Luke. It's by the same author, the same school. And so the image and the stories in the book of or the Gospel of Luke, sort of the people who are receptive to the message are surprising people. And so Acts is saying, yes, very surprising. People throughout the Mediterranean and even beyond want to hear this message, and they will receive this message. The story of the Ethiopian eunuch, for example, St. Philip, comes upon him, and the guy is going back to Ethiopia, and he's reading from the scroll of Isaiah, and, invites Philip to hop in and explain the scriptures to him. And then, the Ethiopian eunuch says, what's stopping me from being baptized? I get this. I believe this. And they stop at some water, and the Ethiopian eunuch is baptized. And that should be surprising. One is, Ethiopia, so far away, and also a eunuch who were generally, yes, they might have had power in the court hierarchy, but they were, also subject to a lot of sort of discrimination and rejection. One of the rules was, eunuchs really aren't supposed to be in the temple. And so clearly the proclamation of the gospel is intended for everyone. So there you have it. Everybody is invited, and everyone can receive this message by the power of the Holy Spirit. Some other things to keep in mind with the book of Acts is that we see the development of the church community and church leadership. Clearly, in the absence of Jesus, you have to figure out who's going to kind of help hold things together. So, Peter and James emerge as leaders of the Jerusalem community. And, they're surprising ones. Again, Peter is a very surprising one. You also have the development of like the office of deacons, that the apostles were responding to an issue in the community, that the Greek-speaking widows and the Hebrew-speaking widows, the Greek-speaking widows felt like they were being left out of almsgiving. And so then the apostles set aside certain folk to be deacons, to wait on tables, to take care of people. We in the modern day might feel a little resistant to that, because we might feel like, oh, it's degrading the act of service. Well, But I like to frame it this way, perhaps. Thinking of modern teachers in schools, so many teachers have to also be social workers and therapists for students, because the students don't have, enough food at home. They don't have a stable home environment. And so, teachers become social workers because a student can't learn if they don't have basic needs met. And yet then the student doesn't get the benefit of a full education. And so wouldn't it be great to have, social workers and therapists that can take care of students' needs, and also have teachers? Neither of them, we want kids to have food and stability and mental health and physical health, and we want them to have knowledge. This is not an either or situation. And so we want teachers to teach, and we want social workers and therapists to do their thing. So we see that sort of specialization then in the church. That different roles are acceptable. We also see hints of early church conflicts. So the book of Acts is not a golden age. The book of Acts is maybe idealized, a little sanitized of some of the conflicts between, say, people that felt that you had to become follow Jewish practices in order to be Christian, and those who said, nope, if you want to follow Jewish practices, that's, and you're Jewish, that's okay, but you following them isn't the thing that saves you. You follow them out of, you want to be closer to God, spiritually, but there are multiple ways of walking with God. And so the early church settled on that. So the book of Acts sort of sanitizes it a little bit, idealizes it. When you read Paul's letters, Galatians especially, the conflict seems a lot stronger in other parts of the New Testament. And, and that's a gift for us, that, conflict is real, conflict happens. It's trying to live out the gospel, which requires effort. It requires, really working things out. And also, as I said, it's not a golden age. We are not trying to go back to the Church of Acts as some ideal, perfect community. They were still struggling. They still had problems. They still had issues. But those issues are not insurmountable, and that you just keep working through them. So another piece of the book of Acts to pay attention to is the experience of persecution. So in the early generations of the church, they were experiencing persecution. Religious leaders were like, who is this Jesus person you're talking about? Can you stop? You're disrupting everything. And political leaders felt the same way. Sort of a quick historical note, the Roman Empire generally had this conciliatory approach to religions. And remember that religion and politics were very much mixed in those days. When they would conquer an area, they would say, okay, we're going to kind of like list up your gods and our gods and show how they're the same. And also you're going to have to throw some incense to the emperor, do some sacrifices to the emperor. Here you go. But Israel got a pass because, one, Romans, although they had, requirements about these things, they also loved really old ancient things. And, the temple in, the worship in Jerusalem was ancient. And so it would get a pass. Okay. And also just knowledge of history is that any province that conquered, the Israelites realized that asking them to worship other gods and to not worship their God was just asking for trouble. And the Romans were very practical. And so they just granted an exception. Okay, we are not going to put up statues of Jupiter in the temple, but just don't rebel. And they would do it very heavy-handedly, but in general, there was kind of an exception for antiquity. But Christianity is clearly a new thing. And so then the protection of it's old doesn't really apply to Christianity. And so then there's this question of, okay, what this upstart religion, what are you doing? If you're trying to get us to stop worshiping our, the old pagan gods, stop doing that. And so then there experiences of persecution. So, I like to compare the experience in the book of Acts with the experience that we get from the gospel and the letters of John. So in the book of Acts, there's, Christianity isn't a threat. Christianity, and so political leaders in the book of Acts are kind of shown as being very curious about Christianity. Oh, would you persuade me to be a Christian? There's that image. So the story in the book of Acts is trying to say there is no conflict between Christianity and Rome. There's no conflict between Christianity and the Roman Empire but people are going to accept it. People even in authority are going to accept this. And then the gospel and letters of John are very much like, nope, it's us against the world. The world is going to oppress us, so stand firm in your faith. No matter what the world does, don't follow it, just follow Jesus. Clearly, both are understandable responses to experiences of persecution. On the one, you want to have receptive leaders. You want to hope that the persecution ends in the book of Acts, and that maybe people who become your persecutor, who are your persecutors, become your friends. Very conciliatory. I get that. And that kind of flows into the example of St. Paul, goes from persecuting the church to being an advocate of the church. And then you have the experience of, the Gospel of John. And that also could be helpful for a community enduring persecution because, if people are doing some terrible things, one, remember they crucified Jesus, they've stoned Stephen, so the risk of being, tortured and executed is very real, very real. And so, if you want to encourage your community, you're like, just hold fast to this. Don't let the darkness, don't let the hate overwhelm you. Don't let it scare you. Just keep strong, keep going, and that you're going to be okay. We're ultimately going to be okay in Jesus. Even if we have to die, we will be okay. So both of those are different responses to persecution, but they're both understandable responses, and both of them have their place. We might theologically lean to one or the other, but clearly two different responses to experiences of persecution. So there you go. There's kind of a thematic introduction to the book of Acts. Clearly a lot of stories I've left out. I've only hinted at some of them because ultimately I want you to read it. And I want you to be able to read it and think, oh, how does this story reflect some of those themes that, Joseph talked about, and also remember that we are the church in Acts. We are not disconnected. Again, with it not being a golden age, they weren't perfect. Neither are we. The church was figuring out how to do what it's doing, and it was taking out this message to the world. And it's not optional to take out the message of Jesus, to proclaim Jesus. Tell others about Jesus who is in your heart, who is in the life of our community together, our local community, the wider community. That's, Jesus is in all these places. And the world wants to hear that comforting message, and they want to have that message of hope. And we offer also the diversity. Just falling back to that one example of responses to persecution, communities that have experienced persecution and oppression. There's the stand strong, like it will be okay. Don't be overwhelmed. Don't be overcome. You will be okay. And can we make them into our friends? How do we get them to be our friends? Wow. Imagine that the circumstances might suggest one or the other, but that either one can proclaim. One proclaims the power of Christ over even death, and one proclaims the reconciling power of Christ. Both are right. Both are right. So I hope that helps with an introduction to the book of Acts, and that it sort of whets your appetite for reading the book. So, all right, have a fun day.